Stories from Maine is a collection of true tales and legendary stories of daring, heroism, absurdity, disaster, and spectacle, all proving why many of the greatest legends in American history are our stories from Maine. One of the greatest legends in American history was a woman who broke gender boundaries in the early 20th century, was an advocate for the common good, helped rebuild a depression-stricken economy, and worked to institute new and fair labor laws and workplace safety in the United States. And this groundbreaking pioneer was a woman from Newcastle, Maine. Stay with us and hear the true story of Frances Perkins, next, on this all-new weekly episode of Stories from Maine. Our podcast begins right now.
This is our Stories from Maine podcast episode for July 26, 2025. Stories from Maine is authored by historian Lori Suzanne Dell. Her books, Stories from Maine and Stories from Maine 2, as well as all of her books, are available through book retailers and can be found on Amazon. All new, weekly episodes of our Stories from Maine podcast stream each Saturday, exclusively on our YouTube channel. And our weekly articles, published in the Brunswick, Maine newspaper, The Times Record, appear online and on newsstands each Friday. And you can follow Stories from Maine on our Facebook page, where we post new Maine history content each day. You can email us at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com.
In a time when women were just beginning to emerge from the cold and dark shadows of second-class citizenship, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt asked one woman to help save America during the Great Depression. Now, let's go over to Oscar, who has this week's feature story of Maine legend, Frances Perkins.
Though Frances Coralie Perkins was born in Boston, Massachusetts, on April 10th of 1880, much about Frances was purely Maine-raised. Her family were Maine people going back to the early settlers. Perkins' mother was Susan Bean of Bethel, Maine. Her father was Frederick Perkins, who hailed from Newcastle, Maine, where the Perkins family had been since the mid-1700s. And Frances spent much of her early life being raised on the family homestead in Newcastle. As a young woman, Frances attended Mount Holyoke College and graduated with a bachelor's degree in chemistry and physics in 1902. She then attended Columbia University and earned her master's degree in sociology and economics. After her education was complete, her family had intended for her to take a quiet teaching position while awaiting a good prospect for marriage, but Frances didn't see it that way. Though Frances did work as a teacher, she became interested in the well-being of low-income Americans and was deeply interested in the movement for women's suffrage, while working for a time in both Illinois and in Philadelphia, before moving into New York City in 1909. By 1910, Frances went to work for the National Consumers League and focused on labor and workplace safety issues in New York City. On March 25th of 1911, a fire broke out at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in Greenwich Village in Manhattan. The factory employed hundreds of workers who worked nearly 55 hours per week at this textile manufacturing company. Located between the 8th and 10th floors of the high-rise building, these immigrant employees worked under harsh circumstances, with few safety rules in place, and were usually locked into the crowded workspaces. When the fire broke out, most of these workers were immediately trapped on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the building. Ladders from the New York Fire Department were unable to reach the floors, and though a valiant effort was made to reach the victims, most died before firefighters could reach them. Frances personally witnessed as many women leapt out of fire-ravaged windows and fell several stories to their deaths, while others died from smoke or flames. When it was over, 123 women and young girls, as well as 23 men, had met a horrible death. New Yorkers, and most Americans, were stunned at the terrible loss of life and angered by the stories of their cruel treatment as employees. Frances Perkins was shaken by the fire, and she determined to do whatever she could to keep such a tragedy from ever occurring again. After the fire, Frances assumed a new position in the city of New York, authorized to improve fire safety, and she was instrumental in pressing for new labor standards, regulating the amount of weekly work hours. When Frances married in 1913, her refusal to take her husband's last name put her in the moral crosshairs of political opponents. Frances had to defend her refusal to take her husband's last name, and the matter landed her in court, where she fought and won the right to remain a married woman, while professionally using her maiden name. By 1916, 36-year-old Frances Perkins had given birth to a daughter, and she took time off to attend to family matters, as her ailing husband was dealing with mental health issues. But 3 years later, in 1919, New York State Governor Al Smith appointed Perkins to the New York State Industrial Commission. Quickly, a political hornet's nest of partisanship saw Perkins come under heavy fire by pro-business politicians and by wealthy industrialists, all of whom opposed Perkins for her perceived politics. Yet, Perkins was confirmed to the position and served to reform the industrial code of the city of New York. Perkins remained in Smith's administration for the full length of his time in office. Then, on October 29th of 1929, the failure of the American stock market had plunged the United States and the world into deep economic chaos. More than 25% of the workforces were evicted from their jobs as factories shuttered and families lost everything. Hopelessness and catastrophe had gripped the nation as desperation, hunger, and homelessness affected every level of society, every race, and every community. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected to the governorship of New York in late 1929, he tapped Perkins to remain in service and serve as his industrial commissioner, making her the first woman to ever hold the high-tier position. Perkins now served in one of the highest-ranking positions in New York state government, and was now in a perfect position to help the New York workforce and the poor. She immediately worked to reduce the amount of hours in a work week, improve safety conditions in the workplace, end child labor, and increase the standard hourly wage, and set up an employee benefit system in New York. By 1932, Governor Roosevelt had won election as the 32nd President of the United States. He immediately appointed Perkins to become the 4th United States Secretary of Labor. As a result, Perkins became the first woman to ever hold a cabinet-level position in a presidential administration in all of American history. We'll be right back.
Our Stories from Maine weekly podcast episodes stream each Saturday on our YouTube channel. And our weekly articles, published in the Brunswick newspaper, The Times Record, appear online and on newsstands each Friday. And, each day, we post images and information on Maine's history on our Facebook page. So, please take a moment to like, share, comment, follow, and subscribe to Stories from Maine on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Stories from Maine. And, you can email us at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com.
Now, let's go back to Oscar for the rest of our feature story on American legend, Frances Perkins.
One of President Roosevelt's first efforts, when he assumed office in March of 1933, was to get Americans back to work and to deliver hunger and relief. When FDR turned to Frances Perkins to serve as the 4th United States Secretary of Labor, Perkins became the first woman to ever serve in a presidential cabinet. And FDR quickly set Perkins upon the Herculean tasks that he outlined as a part of his promised New Deal program. As a member of FDR's famed Brain Trust, Perkins had a lot of ideas, and she was eager to get started.
First, the technique of shortening the hours of labor per day and per week, and second, the technique of raising the income, the wage income or the cash income of those persons who are engaged in employment in the mass production and other industries.
Right away, FDR's New Deal programs were put into effect, and Perkins began working to create many of the alphabet agencies, such as the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration, and she helmed the President's Committee on Economic Security. And much like she did in New York, Perkins helped to write and introduce legislation that improved working hours, working conditions, and overall workplace safety. One of Perkins' original ideas and hard-fought efforts would eventually become realized with the passage of the landmark Social Security Act in 1936. Then by 1938, under her tenure in office, Perkins worked to promote the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act, which drastically reduced child labor in the United States. Out of an American workforce of just over 50 million, nearly 13 million had lost their jobs when the American financial collapse occurred in 1929, and most who remained employed had seen their incomes reduced by nearly half. By the outbreak of the Second World War in December of 1941, Perkins, as Secretary of Labor, had overseen the creation of over 8.5 million jobs. When FDR suddenly died in April of 1945, Frances left her position as Secretary of Labor after 12 years in the job, and she accepted President Harry Truman's request that she assume the post of Commissioner of the United States Civil Service, a post she held until the end of Truman's administration in 1952. Since her entry into the American political workforce in 1910, and throughout her 23 years in Washington, Frances Perkins labored as a true American pioneer in the advancement of women in the workplace, equal rights, fair labor laws, and the regulation and reduction of child labor in the United States. And she delivered immediate humanitarian relief to those in desperate need, helped to create jobs to the unemployed, and implemented laws regulating better working conditions throughout the Great Depression and during World War II. When Frances died at the age of 85, on May 14th of 1965, she had passed as a true American icon. Frances is buried alongside her husband at the Glidden Cemetery in Newcastle, Maine. Today, the Frances Perkins Homestead in Newcastle serves as a learning institute and as an informative reminder that Maine's own Frances Perkins still stands today as one of our greatest American legends and as one of the best of our legendary stories from Maine.
We hope you have enjoyed this story of Maine legend and American pioneer, Frances Perkins. Please join us again next Saturday for another great story from the annals of Maine's history. Thank you for listening.
All Stories from Maine original content is copyright protected, with all rights reserved. Our Stories from Maine logos are trademark protected and may not be used without the express written permission of Stories from Maine author and historian, Lori Suzanne Dell. Thank you for listening. See you next week.